So, good evening. There's another U.S.-initiated crisis that's reached a really ominous, dangerous level this past week with President Trump's announcement that Iran suddenly presented a new, unspecified threat, serious enough to send U.S. naval aircraft carrier battle group, an entire battle group, churning through the Suez Canal into the Persian Gulf, and serious enough U.S. B-52 Stratofortress bombers, and plans for 120,000 troops into the surrounding area. Now, there are already over 50,000 U.S. troops in the region and tens of thousands of military contractors and mercenaries, a whole ring of U.S. bases in the immediate region around Iran. And we should always remember, in terms of who holds the nuclear weapons, of course it's the U.S. and Israel. All those weapons are pointed already at Iran. Now, there was no evidence or information provided regarding this supposed looming threat, except for what Trump was tweeting and ordering forward. He, on Sunday, then threatened to wipe Iran off the map. He had like a Twitter rage, I guess you could say, and said, if Iran wants to fight, that'll be the official end of Iran, never threaten the U.S. again. Now, Iran hadn't threatened the U.S., but it certainly hasn't surrendered either. And that is what Trump, in essence, is demanding. Now, Trump is not the first U.S. official to threaten Iran with genocide. We shouldn't forget Hillary Clinton threatened to obliterate Iran. John McCain used to sing a song, bomb, bomb, bomb Iran. George Bush, he never missed an opportunity to remind Iran that all options are on the table. And last July, Trump put out a tweet, all in caps, saying Iran will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. Now, he actually made a very similar threat to People's Korea not so long ago. And this latest maximum pressure threats against Iran, they follow in the same weeks, really, military threats and extreme sanctions against Venezuela, an escalating trade war with China, which is, that could be a whole educational and talk, a ratcheting up of far harsher sanctions against Cuba, and a firing of an intercontinental ballistic missile across People's Korea, and confiscating a Korean freighter. I mean, this has all happened in this immediate week. Secretary of State Pompeo bragged last year that the Trump administration had just ripped up an agreement that they signed with all the major world powers. It was called the 5+1, all the members of the UN Security Council. U.S. signed it, so did Britain, France, Russia, China, and Germany. That was a 5+1. Signed with Iran to end the sanctions. And instead, they said it was being replaced with the strongest sanctions in history by the time we're complete. And after these sanctions come into full force, Iran will be battling to keep alive. This is the way they speak. Secretary of State Pompeo placed 12 absolutely impossible preconditions on any negotiations. He really demanded that Iran literally become the U.S. cop of the region, drop its support of Palestine totally, ally with and serve Israel, drop its support of the struggle in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, break its relations with neighboring Iraq, allow inspections of any and every industry. I mean, the demands are absolutely staggering. Iran is a large country with a population of 80 plus million, has a very proud national history, and it couldn't meet these demands if it wanted to without total and complete surrender, submission. But the sanctions they're biting deep. We should know that. 80% of the value of the Iranian currency they've lost 80% of the value. So that means there's really a period of wild inflation coming, rising prices, shortages of everything. It's biting deep. The U.S. prediction is that once Iran's economy was close to collapsing, that they would simply crawl to the negotiating table and beg for mercy, or they would break apart. And that, we need to know, is not what's happening. And the fact that it's not is the frustration and the threats that you hear Trump talking about, because they're ratcheting up the demands even further. It hasn't had what they expected it to have. Now Washington is demanding that even the countries that had what were called temporary waivers to purchase Iranian oil, such as China, but also Japan and South Korea and Turkey and India, must all immediately end their purchases, stop importing any Iranian oil, despite the signed contracts, or face immediate sanctions on their economies. This is pretty wild. Now, U.S. imperialist allies, they're allies of corporate power, capitalist countries, have sharply cautioned against these latest wild military measures and threats. Their opposition is because they're also rivals, frankly. It's not based on kindness, not based on this is painful or wrong, but the impact of cutting all Iranian oil is also impacting their economies. So much so that on May 15th, some surprising things have happened that we should really take note of. British Major General Chris Gerka, he's deputy commander of the U.S.-led coalition fighting the so-called Islamic State. He publicly challenged the wild claims of the Trump administration at a press conference at the Pentagon. Sort of an interesting place to do it. And he said there's been no increased threat from Iran-backed forces in Iraq or in Syria. He in effect called them liars. Germany's foreign minister, Heiko Maas, called the U.S. threats ill-advised. It's very polite. Yeah. And he said unilateral and an additional fuse that can carry unintended escalation and great risk. I don't have time to read some of the things, France and Italy and whatnot. Austrian President van der Bellen warned that there's no one in Europe who wants a second Iraq war, and he said it was particularly provocative that the U.S. reimpose sanctions against Iran after pulling out of a signed agreement with Iran that it has, and now it's threatening companies that continue to work with Iran. Even U.S. Congress members, who are usually compliant when it comes to military maneuvers from the Pentagon, military budget, and all of that, suddenly both Republicans and Democrats made statements saying they at least wanted more information. There needed to be more transparency, and raise the disaster of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq and the completely false information in 2003 about weapons of mass destruction. Here they're not even making any claim at all, except that there's a threat, an unknown threat. But this violation of the treaty, the agreement signed with Iran, with other major powers, it wasn't just between the U.S. and Iran, but we should see it in the context that the U.S. has never abided by any treaty. And this is considered the indigenous people of the U.S. More than 500 treaties, every single one of them violated. Now, The hostility toward Iran and the Pentagon war threats are not a new development. They're very much rooted in the 1979 revolution, an enormous revolutionary upheaval that overthrew the Shah of Iran and the whole corrupt Pahlavi royal family, who were really just compliant U.S. puppets and enforcers in the whole region. And the radical demands that came from below, the mass participation in the Iranian Revolution, and the use of nationalized oil revenue for development, it made a dramatic improvement in the standard of health, of education, of housing, of infrastructure. This was 40 years ago, 1979. It transformed not only Iran, it shook up the entire region. There was just this enormous revolutionary upheaval. It was a very radical form of Islam, with very radical demands for social justice. There were workers' general strikes, workers' councils. It was thoroughly anti-imperialist. The main slogan of the Iranian Revolution was "Death to U.S. imperialism." Remember that? And it was especially threatening to the reactionary feudal families that the U.S. and Britain has kept propped up in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates. And in order to counter this, they pumped up, with a lot of U.S. help, the most reactionary forms of Islam. The Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia. They pushed divisions within the Muslim world in an attempt to wall off this huge revolutionary ferment and change. Now, after 1979, within Iran, the country was transformed, went from majority illiteracy to full literacy. And there were especially giant strides for women. Pre-1979, overwhelmingly, the majority of women in Iran were illiterate. Now, 65% of the university graduates are women. Doctors, now women, majority. 70%, this is really interesting, of Iran's science and engineering students are women. And Iran has more female students in engineering fields than any other country in the world. Also, women who choose to be at home can demand and receive paid compensation for housework. So a lot that's happening is far more advanced than in any of the surrounding countries. But just to say, it is still a patriarchal society, as all class society is. There are past traditions, especially in dress code, conduct of women. But they are breaking down fundamental areas of job, family planning, birth control, right to divorce, free, accessible, full health care. We've made huge gains in infrastructure, modern housing, electrification, plumbing, sanitation, highways, communication. All this is very threatening to the U.S. It's very threatening. Now, they are still a very vulnerable and developing country, and they're dependent on the sale of their largest resource, which is oil and gas. That's a fact. Wall Street attempted for 2 decades, using the Pentagon, to stop Iran from building oil refineries, to refine its own oil. They wanted just to export the raw material and then import refined oil back into Iran. That would have made them more vulnerable. And all of this was posed in terms of stopping Iran's development because that would stop them from developing nuclear weapons. Iran didn't have a nuclear weapons program. You wouldn't know it. You wouldn't know it if you followed anything in terms of the news. All the U.S. propaganda was how to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, and to do that, stop all development. So the 2015 agreement that Iran signed in order to end the sanctions was really an agreement with all the group of world powers, as I say, and it was called the P5+1 agreement. It's my time. the hope was that these 6 countries signing on would be a weight on the U.S. threats. So when they ripped it up, just before they did, Iran had already complied with every part of this agreement. They had to turn over 98% of their low-grade uranium that had been processed, 98%, and allow inspections all over the place. They abided by everything, and also there was $100 billion in Iranian funds that was supposed to be unfrozen. Didn't happen. Still in U.S. banks. They're holding on to it. They agreed this would be released. So now it's the U.S. who's violated all the key provisions and the ability to sell its oil, and they're making military threats. They're attempting to stop Iran from exporting oil to its customers. It's happening at the same time as the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela and Cuba, Zimbabwe, other countries. And all of this is a form of collective punishment, where they're bragging about how much pain they can create. This is outlawed by international law. It impacts the population. It was UN studies that said 1.5 million children and 500,000 children and 1.5 million people impacted by died from the sanctions in Iraq. We shouldn't forget those figures. 500,000 children. Madeleine Albright acknowledged it. Said this is worth it. This is worth it. That's the way they think. So maybe I have some closing points, but maybe I'll make it after the discussion. I want to really discuss this whole idea of this is a war for oil, because it's much more than a war for oil. That's often expressed. Of course, oil is involved, but it is an attack in every form on all the people of the world, and we really have to see it in every sense linked up in that way, and linked to the struggle here, where the U.S. is more and more really at a dead end. Really at a dead end, and their only way of survival is to put the entire world, including their allies and their rivals, other countries, on edge all the time while they make more and more demands in more and more dangerous ways. So all of this needs to be understood, seeing the connections at every step and resisting it and linking it to the struggle here. That's what we're about, always linking these struggles together, seeing this as very much part of the class struggle against an archaic, tiny, criminal class that has stolen everything, and against a rising movement globally around the world and right here. So the other points I think we'll save for the discussion, and thanks that Kazem raised. And a question, should Iran, again, negotiate with the U.S.? Well, it's the U.S. that set these unmeetable preconditions to any negotiation. And so, of course, before there can be any new round of negotiations, the U.S. would have to drop all preconditions. So who would that be who's stepping back? Iran has certainly said they're willing to keep talking, but they are demanding that the countries that signed the pact with the U.S. abide by it, continue to abide by it, and continue to purchase the oil and not apply the sanctions. So the test is really, it is true, there's a real war of wills, not just with Iran, but with the whole rest of the world, major economies. And it's what seizing the Korean freighter was really all about. Completely lawless. They said, well, this freighter is breaking U.S. sanctions. Who are they sending a message to? To Venezuela and Cuba, who are freighters going back and forth? To Iran. And Iran didn't even have to reply to the message, because, you know, one ship in the Straits of Hormuz would shut down shipping, if it came to that. You know, so there's a lot of threat, counter-threat, and implied understanding. But certainly it's all being ratcheted up in a fantastic way. I mean, to just rip up this agreement, or to seize a Korean freighter, for violating U.S. sanctions, not followed by any other country in the world. But Kazem asked another question, and that is, should Iran trust Russia, China, or any of the countries it has significant trading agreements with? I think certainly other countries have shown that it's not a question of trust. The determination has to come from within the country itself. Cuba, when the whole socialist bloc had collapsed, said socialism or death. We will go back to farming with oxen. We'll do without the oil. It was a hard period. In People's Korea, they call it jushe, self-reliance. They say it's the only way to survive. It's the determination themselves. They are no one's pawn. And in Iran, it is the same thing. It's not a case of trusting or appealing to another country. They are making plans to survive this. As, by the way, Cuba is also making plans. They say we have to reinstitute rationing because we can see what's coming. And we have to be prepared for a difficult time ahead because we're going to survive it. That kind of determination is what countries all over the world are showing. I'm glad Joe raised Al-Quds Day because there's no country, no people, no nation more absolutely beleaguered. I mean, how can a population smaller than the population of Brooklyn survive as the people of Gaza? Al-Quds Day is Jerusalem Day. It stands for all the Palestinian people, but against the most impossible odds, that resistance continues. I'm confident there's going to be a strong turnout next Friday. It's on the sign-up sheets here. We're sending emails. Speakers bring signs. It's very important. Times Square. I'm also glad that Shahid raised the right-wing Modi government just won in this election. It has a lot to do with what we're talking about with the struggle here for abortion rights, reproductive rights. That this dying capitalist system can only rely on religious fanaticism of the most reactionary sort and use it against other peoples. So you have a form of very reactionary Hindu nationalism in India taking hold against a very large, more than almost 15% of the population of India is Muslim, and very sharply against the other religious minorities, particularly the Muslim population, and an effort to also revive the whole caste privilege and a kind of very reactionary Hindu nationalism. So it goes right in the face of, and everywhere around the world. We could talk about the rise of fascism in Europe. Everywhere the capitalists feel threatened, they're reaching back to the most reactionary forms and ideology. And it's really increasingly the workers' movements that are the only response to this. It goes with Michael's point. The U.S. attempt to use small nationalities within Iran against the Iranian state. And it hasn't succeeded before, and it isn't going to succeed now. It really is not. These are tiny, like mercenary U.S.-funded bands that go in, but they have like zero following. That's a real problem for the U.S., but not for Iran. So I think we want to really look at that role that sort of reactionary religion, reactionary ideas have, and who's using them, and also know that any struggle for change has to appeal, by its very nature, to solidarity among all the people. That's the only way forward. Now, I wanted to make this point about war for oil, that it's not, we often use the term no war for oil ourselves, but it's not just a war for oil. The U.S. is now an oil exporter based on fracking, completely environmentally destructive. But it's a new technology that also destroyed the mine workers. And now, take West Virginia. It was once the most unionized, proportionately unionized state in the country. And once the mine workers were organized, everybody, grocery store clerks, all kinds of folks in West Virginia were unionized. Technology changed. They really broke the miners' union, and they've broken all the unions. And West Virginia went for Trump. I mean, reaction took a hold. And it's important because that also, there's an effort to push it back. So we should just be aware. This is something that, and I guess I'll sort of end on this, that Marx raised in the Communist Manifesto about the union of the workers. So these aren't just wars for oil. They're wars for domination of global market where any resistance is threatening. Cuba does not have oil, nor does North Korea, the DPRK, or Zimbabwe, or Vietnam. They don't have oil, so why are they targeted? Think about it. They're targeted, and it's not even that these are wars against socialism at this point, as a 40-year Cold War against the Soviet Union was. And in some of these countries, there's still a capitalist class that exists. Smaller, the big resources are nationalized, but food warehouses and media and whatnot might still be privately owned, as they are in Venezuela right now. But every one of these countries are threatening because there's big workers' movements that are making demands, and there are governments that are built and put in place by workers' movements with all of the unevenness of development. But there are big social programs that benefit the whole population. And that is what is so threatening. It's not even who has nationalized oil. I mean, Saudi Arabia nominally has nationalized oil, right? But in Saudi Arabia, it's all owned by the Saud royal family, the whole country, lock, stock, and barrel. So they just use it as the U.S. uses it as a cash cow. They just milk it to pay for their wars abroad and for big weapons sales. So we don't want to just use a word. We wanted to see what's going on underneath. What's a danger to Wall Street? What is a danger is every form of resistance. And that's true here. The capitalist class in the U.S., while they make war on every union, they are threatened and will attempt to stop laundry workers, sex workers, fast food workers, disabled workers. Any group of workers who are organizing is a threat to them. Is consciously, they're supremely class conscious, much more than the working class usually. They know what's a threat. And we have to have that same feeling of what is a threat and be with it, heart and soul. So the only thing they have at this point is weapons. U.S. is the number one weapons exporter, supplier. It's the only thing they can threaten. They're aircraft carriers, and that alone can't do it. And I'll end with this, Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. It's 150 years new. But he said that now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of the battle is not in the immediate victory. It's in the ever-expanding union of the workers. And it is pushed forward by advances in communication. Now, Marx didn't foresee instant communications, but there's not a worker anywhere in the world that doesn't know it's a global workforce. And workers of all different countries and cultures and nationalities are in touch with each other. He also, Marx said, the class struggle is at root a political struggle. And it's the workers who grow stronger with every battle. So we should see the struggle in Iran, we should see the struggle in Palestine, in Venezuela, in Cuba, and right here in the same way.